Thank you, dear panelists. I was very struck by what one of you, Felipe, just said about how we get private sector players motivated by making a financial return, and public sector bodies, which manage the mass transit systems in most of our cities, how do we get them together on the same page to develop projects that deliver for all the citizens of a city, even the poorest? It's not very easy to find that common spot. And then when you bring financiers into the equation, and they definitely want a return, will they still be interested? Well, that's what our next panel is about. Financing today's mobility innovations. How do we get them off the ground? And I'm delighted to welcome you now to our moderator from Trucks Venture Capital, Reilly Brennan, and his distinguished guests. Reilly.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here in Riyadh. I want to start off by saying thank you to my friend John Rassant and to His Excellencies for being here and for hosting us. I think for a few of us, it's our first trip to Riyadh, and I'm only 12 hours in, but I would say thumbs up, so I'm having a great time. Just a brief introduction on the panelists before we get going. I'm Reilly Brennan. I'm the co-founder of Trucks Venture Capital. We're a very early stage investor in transportation across many different sectors, and I've been fortunate enough to back a lot of great founders, and I think one of the interesting parts about this particular segment is you automatically have to get to know the full capital stack if you're going to raise something in transportation. Usually the capital needs are significant, and so you're fortunate that we have the full capital stack here with us today, and we'll go down the line. I want to do just a brief intro and then maybe the most recent investment you've made. So we'll start with Sid from Temasek. If you could give us a brief intro of yourself and Temasek and a recent investment.
Yeah, it's a great pleasure to be here today, attending CoMotion in Riyadh. Introduction about myself, I'm Sid. I am with Temasek, which is a global investment organization. We manage about 300 billion plus, and we invest across various sectors and various regions as well. I currently lead our mobility and logistics team. And we have a global mandate to invest across the entire mobility and logistics value chain. We are typically focused on slightly larger investments, but I'll speak about some of the recent investments we have made. And the two thematics around which we are very focused are one, the electrification of transportation, and second is digitization, which really is autonomy and the entire value chain around it. And one of the interesting things I think in this space is that unlike some other areas where the technology doesn't exist, in electrification it does. And especially in road transportation, we have seen significant uptake of electric vehicles around the world. So I'll talk about a recent investment we made about a year and a half, 2 years back, in a company called Mahindra Electric in India. And this was a very clear bet on, I would say, three things. One, a direction of travel, which is electrification in the Indian market. Clearly very, very early and much behind, let's say, China, which is now 50% plus in terms of EV penetration. But we really felt that this was an interesting segment, which is very early in its growth stage. The second thing which we really liked was the team, and this is something I want to emphasize. As we look across all these solutions which have some link to sustainability or clean solutions, it is very important to have a compelling product which customers really like, and there's a sense of affordability about it. So Mahindra has a long history in the automotive sector, and they had specialized in the SUV segment even when they were producing ICE vehicles. So we saw a real commitment from the team. They created this separate entity to focus specifically on electric vehicle SUV models. And the progress has been amazing. We have had very successful launches of 2 products last year. A new variant just came out last week. And I think from a partnership perspective, this is the kind of thing we're really trying to enable across the EV or AV value chain. Work with companies who have clear business plans and really looking to make an impact in terms of what they're doing. So yeah, Reilly, that was a very interesting one for us recently.
Thank you. Joseph?
Thank you. Name is Joseph Kirikian. I'm the Chief Investment Officer of TASARU Mobility Investments, which is an entity established by PIF about 3 years ago. We're fully owned by PIF, fully funded by PIF, and our mission and our scope is to develop the full automotive ecosystem in Saudi Arabia. And this includes everything from localizing the tier 1 manufacturers behind Seer, Lucid, and Hyundai, all the way to autonomous solutions, logistic solutions, and so on. We've invested since we kicked off 3 years ago in 7 transactions, a couple of autonomous solutions. I'll get into them later. The last investment that we made was in a logistics joint venture. It was a 3-way joint venture with Bahrain, Mosul, to basically provide a last mile solution for the automotive industry, and that was a JV here in Saudi. The other deal that we're very proud of that we announced also recently was an investment in Blacklane at the topco level, where we helped this company expand its operations into Saudi Arabia, and I'll delve into that later on how we structure these transactions to meet both commercial but yet also strategic needs of the country.
Thanks, Joseph. Majid.
Thanks, Reilly. Majid Mufti. I lead the NEOM Investment Fund, which is essentially the investment arm of the NEOM project. And I think most people know the NEOM project, which is a 2-hour flight northwest of here, building a sustainable urban development of the future. Comes with that is a whole host of mobility solutions that are required to be electrified, to be available and connected into one platform. And so our investment thesis has been investing into everything from Boom, which was the supersonic aircraft, all the way to micro-mobility. I think our last one was with Pony, that's probably worth highlighting, which got listed on the NASDAQ exchange. It also had a dual listing just recently, some weeks ago, or maybe last month on the Hong Kong exchange, and that's autonomous vehicles as well.
Thanks, Majid.
Thanks, Reilly.
Chris
I'm Chris Thomas. I'm a co-founder and partner of Assembly Ventures. We're the first transatlantic mobility fund in the world. Our interests and teams sits across Detroit, Berlin, Silicon Valley, and Dubai. And we invest uniquely in Series C to B in holistic mobility, which we define as the physical and digital movement of people, goods, data, and energy, and across air, land, sea, and space. So our investors include companies and families like Stellantis, Mann & Hummel, Vontier, the Ford family, the Van Hagen family, and we look across the Western world as to the ways in which the world's going to move. We've about 16 companies that are public today, again, across all those schemes. One recent one I'll speak to is a company called Aptronic, focused on humanoid robotics. This is one that we invested in only last year at around a $250 million valuation. We have some upcoming announcements with their most recent round, but prior to this, at a $1.4 billion valuation, our friends at Google DeepMind, with their Gemini Robotics AI platform, came into the business. Just tremendous momentum within that one individual space, and it's really exciting to be here.
Thanks, Chris. Joseph, I'd like to go back to you. I'd love to hear kind of the unique challenges of this region that you see as opportunities. I think, we were talking about the types of things you invest in to support the companies that are already here. It's a fascinating way to think about helping to build the supplier ecosystem. So I'd love if you could talk about the challenges, particularly of this region, and what you're trying to do to address that.
Definitely. So the biggest challenge for us, I would say, is structuring these transactions, because like I said, we have a dual mandate, and to make sure that every investment that we make has the commercial returns, but yet at the same time it meets the country's needs. That's a bit of a challenge, and it's very unique the way we structure these opportunities, because most of the time we're investing with global leaders to help their operations expand into the region. So for example, the 2 ways we invest is, one is a joint venture, where the joint venture has to be based in Saudi, it has to be a cash for cash transaction, and it has to be addressing the local market mainly. The second way we invest is investing at the topco level. So for example, with Blacklane, we led a round that invested in Germany at the topco. This was purely growth capital. It was primary, but the growth capital is used to expand the country's operations in Saudi. Now, if we think about all these prerequisites that we have in our investment criteria, obviously you will not have that many opportunities if you're this strict. However, in the last 3 years, we delivered 7 transactions, which is a pretty sizable delivery.
Absolutely. I wonder, sorry, do you have more to add to that, Joseph? No. Majid, I wonder if you could give us your insight too in terms of the unique challenges of this region and opportunities you see as great investments now and in the next few years.
As a region, I think it's unique in some ways, but not overly unique in others, in the sense that when you think of cities, Chris, it's your first time to Riyadh, you'll probably experience the traffic. And the traffic is problematic globally, whether it's Taipei or Shanghai or Beijing, all the way across to Los Angeles, where Joseph's from. We see an incredible amount of sticky problems, which is population continues to grow, right? EVs are becoming cheaper to buy. The middle class continues to grow to be able to be affordable to buy these vehicles. And so the influx of people coming into cities is only talking about one real problem, which is the congestion problem. Now, governments will continue to invest into public transportation, and we've done that here as well. We now have electrified buses that are now running. We've got the metro finally running, but you'll still have that problem with that last mile delivery, or last mile for people to get to their final destinations. And whether it's a cold climate globally or a very hot climate within Saudi for people to continue that final journey, that public transportation can only go as far in terms of solving that problem. And so I think when we take a look at what's happening globally on the front of autonomous vehicles, the advent of what new technologies have coming in to be able to connect and digitize a lot of that, electric batteries, all of that is starting to come in together, I think, to be able to solve a public transportation problem that we still have as a gap. So to your point, the gap that is existing globally continues to also exist here. Metro is also only in Riyadh, it's not in Jeddah yet, or in Dhahran, or in the East Coast. So I think we need to really think of what are the elements that are starting to come together to be able to solve that problem. And when I take a look at and hear from Joseph what they're doing at TASARU, what we've got with Lucid, what we've got with Sear, what we've got with IVIC, which is now the PIF company that's helping on promoting EV charging with a large network, we're seeing the underpinnings of what could be the enablers of using autonomous vehicles in the future as an Uber, rather than people owning their vehicles. I mean, one thing that your car today, as they say, 95% of the time is just sitting idle. It's not incurring any economic value to the owner. And so if you want to actually think about it in a different way, you've got Lucid, which is the premium cars, you've got Sear, which is the mid-tier cars, you've got Uber technologies, you've got a system. Why can't we start working towards using vehicles that takes you all the way to your final destination as your mode of public transportation of sorts?
And I think this is one of the fascinating moments from an investor perspective, just kind of thinking about the AV world. I've been investing in automated vehicles for about 10 years, and it always felt like it was 10 years away when we were making that. And then something happened in the last 24 months where it was like all of a sudden it's here. And so all of us on this panel have made an investment in some sort in AVs. And I think it's a really interesting moment because it kind of does speak to the fact that with the way that we've seen growth in the Middle East, it feels like VTOLs and AVs are going to be able to be written into the fabric of our life in a much different way than we see in other cities. So I'm really excited about that. I'd love for you, Sid, to talk a little bit about Waymo and your views on AVs. Waymo is, by some measure, in the private markets, maybe worth as much as a handful of car companies out there, and clearly will be a dominant player. My question for you is Waymo a global business, or will there be a handful of regional winners in AV?
Yeah, no, thank you, Reilly. Great question. And we have been investors in Waymo for about 5 years now. If I think back about robotaxis and autonomy, there was this wave of I think, enthusiasm and a lot of excitement about 7, 8, 10 years back. And if you remember, it kind of died down for a bit. And then electric vehicles were very strong when Tesla's breakout year happened in 2020. And we have always taken the view that one of the most important things in the robotaxi space, and one of the reasons we backed Waymo, was not just technology leadership. There's an aspect of having the capital and the patience to build a business. And what is tied to that is the aspect of having safety first. I think it's very critical because if you're running a robotaxi operation, where even after so many years of trialing and operations, Waymo is still dealing with edge cases which it has to find solutions for, right? So having a safety first mindset, I think, has served the company extremely well. I'll address your question about whether it's a global business or not. What we see is there is clearly an ecosystem of AV companies in China, which are very strong, which are expanding outside. And then you have a Waymo, a Tesla in the US. Obviously, there's Mobileye in Israel and some other companies as well. But there are sort of 2, 3 ecosystems. And the way we perceive it is Waymo will have a strong position in the US context, but they will want to go outside, that's for sure, because there's no reason why this technology does not translate beyond your initial country of operation, in this case, the US for Waymo. There's an aspect of regulations here, which is quite important to keep in mind, given the regulatory dynamic can be quite different in each market. I'm based in Singapore, and we have taken a very, very cautious approach to this thing. Singapore is usually quite technology forward-leaning, but in terms of robotaxis, we are still not anywhere close to deployment, right? So I think over time, Reilly, to your question, Waymo will become a global business, but there will be a lot of competition as well. So it'll be interesting to see how this shapes out.
Chris, you and I have invested in a handful of AV companies together, notably autonomy, which became Motional, and Gatic. There might even be a few others that I've forgotten, but I would love to hear from your perspective, what is the American investor point of view on AVs at the moment? And specifically, if a new startup came to you today and said, we're going to take down Waymo, we're starting from whole cloth, we're a brand new startup, we're going to begin on January 1, 2026, do you think that we're at the end of the first cycle of AV, or would you be crazy enough to fund a new AV company in America?
I think we're at the end of the beginning, but I think we're very, very early. We were talking earlier, and I think we talked in terms of mobility holistically. The train hasn't even left the station. There's so much that we are still about to develop and about to deploy. So the answer to your question is, if that pitch comes in, and that pitch actually does come in, I take every one of those meetings. Now, we haven't invested in a company on a standalone basis. It didn't have that special potpourri of the founder, the technology, the TAM, the approach. But there's going to be billion-dollar businesses that are not created yet who are going to be incredibly important in the mobility ecosystem. So I think from a US perspective, we are looking very deeply at those types of approaches. We're also seeing kind of the re-entrenchment at global North American automotive companies like GM. You've seen Sterling Anderson now come into the C-suite, pushing again, a captured autonomous program with an individual OEM. It's going to be interesting to see how that plays out, especially since Cruise was kind of disbanded not too many months ago. But I think as we think about how this is going to deploy, it goes to something that you were just talking about, Sid. I think there's going to be geographic champions. I think one of the major underlying premises of Assembly is that we believe the world very much is bifurcating and will continue to do so. And we'll see how that plays out. But there will be Chinese champions in China, there'll be American champions in America. And then the question is, where are those technologies going to deploy, and where are the individual geographies from a continental or a country perspective going to want those technologies in their backyard? And that's going to be very fascinating, not only in terms of the TAM those companies have the chance to go after, but also to see how they deploy and who they deploy alongside.
Chris, I'd love to stay with you just on the sort of industrial policy perspective. When you think about things that go into an AV, battery, chip, software, these are strategic components of a vehicle, but it's also becoming clear that these are strategically important at a national level. And it has felt over the last few years, as robotaxis became more real in our life, that these robots were potentially going to have some sort of national component to them, and we'd have to think about them as not just individually owned vehicles, but perhaps as controlled by another entity. how important is it for the industrial policy of a country to align with some of these technology bets that, for example, you're making at the early stage?
It's critically important. I would offer it's table stakes. And I think it begins with having a long view. You guys have very kindly welcomed me to my first visit here in Riyadh. And as I look around, I see a long view. I see a place that is looking to build not for today or this year or this decade, but for a very long time. When we're thinking about the companies we're investing right now, and not only that, when we're looking at our portfolio holistically, we are very focused on ensuring that the second and third order supply chain, how are we thinking about not just the manufacturing, but the overall and under overall logistics aspects of those component parts are on-sourced or allied sourced, are manufactured within borders or within borders in which we have an understanding of continuity. So there has been a huge change over the last decade since we began looking at this in terms of differentiated component parts as a part of full-stack autonomous systems, for example. I think this is not just going to be within Department of War. This is not just going to be within the dual-use ecosystem, but it's going to be civilian utilization within defined boundaries. That's going to be a huge part of how companies deploy and how they think about their overall partnerships on a supplier basis.
Majid, I'd love to ask you about, in running this investment fund for NEOM, how many people come to you and what sort of companies are coming to you saying, I need to be in NEOM myself, I need to put our company there, and give me a flavor for what's your investment funnel look like, the opportunities. You don't have to name specific companies, but I imagine a lot of people want to deploy there, and love if you could just give us an idea of that.
No, absolutely, Reilly. And I think when we take a look at the different modes of mobility, we're talking about land, sea, and air, right? All forms, but also within the city. And that's where micromobility becomes interesting. And so part of even injecting the designs of what a new urban development looks like is to come up with new forms of transportation that haven't been thought up, such as, pods. And so, there have been companies coming out and visiting with us out of the US and LA in particular, who have been working with some of our architects or designers to say, how could this be embedded as part of the rails and the infrastructure there? But in general, I think the appetite from our side for a lot of these technology companies to come in and pilot and deploy and scale and co-develop is voracious from our side. I mean, if we were going to talk about, to Chris's point, long-term views of transportation, NEOM is the hub for being that living lab where we want to trial, we want to deploy, want to be at the frontier of technology adoption. And with that comes a real desire from many of the founders to say, look, if your brand equity says that, you've trialed this and it works, and if you become a purchaser of our technology in the future, then you as a strategic investor bring a lot more to the table than a financial investor would. And that becomes hugely interesting. And then we're able to bake in what Joseph was talking about, which is how can we translate that investment and the use of funds into a strategic relevance that helps localize businesses in Saudi and in NEOM. But we just don't need to be too difficult in the very beginning because we are talking about long-term bets. And that's when we're seeing sort of a level of partnership that has a similar objective that we're working towards. And that becomes hugely important.
We have just a few minutes left, and particularly with this group and all the things you're looking at, I'd love to get a sense of what you think is mispriced today, whether it's too high or too low. So I'm going to start with Joseph, and then we'll go around the horn. So, Joseph, what do you think in the market today? It could be stuff that's within your remit or without, that's mispriced.
It's a good question. I'm thinking of.
Just use the mic.
It's a good question. I'm thinking of a couple of investments that we made. One of them was in AI solutions out of California, where we invested in this semiconductor design company. luckily we came in early, so we did not ride the mispricing. But I see a bit of mispricing in that sphere. Autonomous is another area where I see a bit of mispricing. But I'll touch on Holon. The way we structured that deal when we entered the investment is we said, look, let's put the valuation aside because we're never going to see eye to eye. We're never going to agree. So we came up with a different structure where we injected our capital and their capital along with their know-how, but we structured it in a way that guaranteed us a certain return. And if we didn't meet it, then we had a carve-out that kicks in. So there are ways to structure these deals, especially if we want to take that exposure. It's an important exposure to have. That's why we did those autonomous solutions. But these are the two areas where I would see a bit of a mispricing nowadays.
Thank you. Sid?
Yeah, it's an interesting time. I feel, as I was mentioning earlier, electrification in some ways probably is a bit underappreciated right now, given some of the challenges we've had in terms of penetration.
At the OEM level
growth.
or supplier level? Or?
At the OEM level, yes. Definitely in the broader ecosystem as well, if you think about suppliers. Mm-hmm. On the autonomy side, and this extends, I think, not just to robotaxi operators, but even LiDAR manufacturers and other players in the value chain. It seems more reasonable. There could be specific companies, I think, where you can argue whether there's an optimistic view. But look, at the end of the day, I think it all depends on how fast these companies will scale and ramp. Yeah. And one of the things we have seen, I guess, in EVs, you have got now large companies. If you think about a Tesla or a BYD, they're 100 billion revenue companies, right? So that's substantial. What is interesting in autonomy is, after all these years, you still don't have any companies of scale in terms of actual revenue. And just set aside profit even for a second, right? So it'll be interesting to see. I think if the businesses scale, and I think the use case is quite compelling. One of the interesting things we've had from Waymo also is very positive customer feedback on the experience of riding a robotaxi. So I think, in autonomy, I think it will really depend on whether scaling happens. But on electrification, I think there's probably value to be had.
Got it. Chris?
I'll do one overpriced and two underpriced, but the two underpriced stay among us in this room. You can't tell anybody. So the overpriced, I think, is holistic AI. Maybe that's just something that it's obviously
holistic
happening.
AI.
Just AI, big picture. I think
all singing, all dancing AI.
Indeed, we are in a bubble personified. But I will say that AI, from an infrastructure perspective, companies, we're very lucky to have led an investment in a company called Metropolis, which is real-time payment for automotive in any automotive environment. This is proprietary neural networks AI in the real world. Huge efficiencies for cities, huge convenience for consumers and customers and citizens. That's going to be very valuable. Undervalued, space tech. We are spending a lot of time and have some upcoming announcements. A very good friend of mine always likes to say, Chris, that a 1x on Earth is a 10x in space. We are going to see huge opportunities there, not enough capital is being deployed. And then also undersea tech, but especially monitoring for meta-ocean data. This is for weather as well as for differentiated opportunities in hurricane kind of monitoring, but also from a defense perspective in terms of dual drones in the Baltic and the East China Sea. That's going to be incredibly interesting.
Thanks. Majid, what do you believe is mispriced out there?
Well, I mean, we're talking to a lot of companies and different technologies, so I'd rather not prejudice any of those developments that are taking place. Where, again, we're always seeing the cup half full. But I would say, Hyperloop back in the days was overpriced. I mean, today, CoMotion 2025, I don't think it's mentioned once compared to maybe when CoMotion started back in 2017, 18, when if you did a search word between the two events, you're going to see it maybe mentioned once today and many, many times back in the days. And that was really priced at a point that, was unreasonable. And I think that's what we need to worry about, because a lot of that capital could have also, whilst we want for things to work out, at some point, there's better uses for a lot of that capital in the mobility space where we need to work towards cohesively.
It's the reality, right? When they work out, they all feel underpriced. But when they don't, they all feel way too expensive. And I have the scar tissue to prove that. I would love to finish just with a question for the panelists. When it comes to things that are not in your current portfolio, but you really respect, that are out there, it could be that something that maybe you did look at, you passed on, or maybe you never saw it. But we'd love to hear, what are the companies out there that are not in your book that you think have a really interesting angle or have a potentially a really bright future? And I'll start with you, Sid.
Yeah, I think too many to mention that we have missed. But I would say, look, we have spent a lot of time on advanced air mobility on the eVTOL space. And while it's early days, I do think there are some very interesting companies there, whether it's a Joby or a Beta Technologies, where there's both commercial applications from a passenger use case perspective, but there's also a cargo element to this thing, and increasingly defense applications. And that's, I think, one sector where we did spend a lot of time, and I think there's some great companies which we admire and continue to follow. Hopefully at some point they will be in our portfolio.
Great, thanks, Sid. Joseph?
Yeah, I agree. There's too many to mention, but perhaps I can touch on the segment.
Sure.
And it's really the manufacturing, and when I say manufacturing, closer to the theme of taking advantage of what Saudi has, which is the raw materials. And now that manufacturing is moving more to robotics, high precision, high value add type of manufacturing, those are the types of opportunities now we're thinking of approaching and localizing.
Great, thank you. Majid?
I think maybe just a quick couple. Drones and using drones for mobility of transportation, not so much individuals like the eVTOLs. I agree. I mean, that's a space that hopefully will come through. But I think a lot of the roads are congested by just delivery. And if there are different modes, and if we're seeing that the payload starts to come in, then that's an area that could really help the decongestion. And I think of things, in terms of what's the highest impact on society. And again, it really does come down to vehicles and how best we can do that. And I think it's not just a solution. I think it's all the elements that we talked about today that are coming together. And at some point, there will be that inflection point that says, okay, there's a real true democratization that's actually taking place from ownership, from usage, from using the Uber type of apps to be able to just move from one place to the other, as opposed to what we're doing today. And so I think that's the biggest impact that I feel like, is underserved.
Thank you. And Chris?
I really like that comment on impact. I think it's something that people throw out there, but it's not captured quite like that. There was one of the earlier speakers who talked about what is the purpose of mobility, and he mentioned dignity. And I think, what are the end states? What are we trying to accomplish here? So for me, two companies that I think have an amazing mission and are looking to enshrine the underlying philosophies of the places that they're from are Anduril and Helsing. I'm incredibly impressed with their execution. I'm incredibly impressed with how they're looking holistically. But the only way those companies succeed is if they do so within a framework of partnership and a framework of understanding the entire capital stack. And that's from a federal industrial policy perspective to multiple established players to young startups. Before we got here, I was talking with my colleague Felix, who's here with me, and John, we were talking about you and what a wonderful community you've brought here. And we were thinking about, why is this so valuable? Well, this is the capital stack that we get excited about investing alongside, I think, because we represent all the different pieces of the capital you need. But it's not just the capital. You can find capital. It's the intent, it's the mission, it's the desire to have impact. And I think any company that is doing that in a huge way, that I may or may not have missed investing in, I get upset about that.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you to my panelists, and thank you to all, and we'll see you at the next session.
Fantastic.